David Thompson had always been the kind of cop people admired. At 42, he had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the streets of New York City, making a name for himself as a dedicated and relentless officer. His colleagues saw him as a role model, a man who could crack the toughest cases, always focused, never distracted. With his tall, solid frame, short-cropped black hair, and piercing blue eyes, David commanded respect wherever he went. He was the kind of person whose presence filled a room, though he rarely spoke unless it was necessary. David's life revolved around his work, his loyalty to the badge apparent in every move he made. Early on, he had made sacrifices that most of his peers couldn't fathom. Late nights spent poring over case files instead of attending family dinners, missed birthdays, and canceled vacations. It all came with the territory. When asked about his personal life, David would brush it off with a smirk. "The job is my life," he'd say. But deep down, there was a void, a gnawing feeling that something critical was missing. Over the years, his career achievements had come at a steep cost. He'd been through a divorce in his early 30s, a relationship that had crumbled under the pressure of long hours and emotional distance. His ex-wife, Karen, had once pleaded with him, "David, we need you at home. I need you here with me." But duty always came first for him. Even after the marriage ended, David buried himself in his work, convinced that this was where he was needed the most. Any attempt at rebuilding his personal life felt pointless. As his career flourished, his personal relationships faded into the background. Friends stopped calling when he kept canceling plans, and the distance between him and his aging parents grew wider. His apartment, a modest space in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, was more like a pit stop than a home. He'd spend just enough time there to shower, sleep, and gear up for the next shift. Though outwardly strong and capable, David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was walking through life alone. There was a heaviness in his chest that no amount of commendations or closed cases could lift. The admiration of his colleagues only magnified the loneliness he tried so hard to ignore. For David, being a hero on the job had come at the price of his own happiness, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending it didn't matter. David's days followed a rhythm that most people would find grueling. His mornings started before dawn, the dark streets of New York still quiet, with only the hum of city life beginning to stir. He'd grab a quick black coffee from the bodega on the corner. No sugar, no cream, just the strong bitterness that kept him alert for what was always an unpredictable day ahead. The precinct buzzed with activity when he arrived. Officers hustled between desks, phones rang incessantly, and the constant clatter of keyboards filled the air as reports were typed. David's desk was a mess of papers, unsolved cases, and reports that needed filing. He liked it that way. The chaos made him feel productive, even if it did little to distract him from the growing solitude that haunted him. Every day felt the same. Routine patrols, occasional emergency calls, and the rare but intense moments of action. David could feel the city's pulse under his fingertips, but lately, it was as if he was only watching life go by rather than living it. He dealt with the worst of humanity: domestic disputes, drug overdoses, burglaries gone wrong. Each case left him a little more worn down, a little more detached. In the breaks between the chaos, David found himself alone with his thoughts. He'd watch the younger officers chat about their weekends, their kids, their plans. For David, weekends meant extra shifts, and plans were a luxury he hadn't afforded himself in years. The phone in his apartment rarely rang anymore, and when it did, it was mostly spam calls or occasional work-related matters. His closest family, his sister living in Chicago, called sometimes, but their conversations were brief, filled with awkward pauses. "You're always so busy," she would say, and David would agree, making promises to visit that he never kept. Despite being surrounded by people constantly, David couldn't remember the last time he had a meaningful conversation with someone. The loneliness clung to him like a second skin, and he felt it most deeply when he was off duty. Even walking the bustling streets of Manhattan, with people brushing past him in waves, he felt like a ghost, unseen and unremarkable outside of his uniform. He often worked late into the night, not because he had to, but because going home meant facing the silence of his empty apartment. The precinct was his life now, the only place where he felt a sense of purpose. But every now and then, In the quiet moments between calls, David would catch himself wondering, was this it? Had he sacrificed too much? The absence of connection weighed on him, making him question if this relentless dedication to his work was truly worth the emptiness that came with it. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when David first met Emily. He had just wrapped up a grueling 12-hour shift and decided to stop by a small cafe near the precinct, one he rarely visited despite it being just around the corner. The cafe was warm, filled with the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of quiet conversations. David wasn't looking for anything more than a moment to relax before heading home to his usual routine. As he stood in line, lost in his thoughts, his attention was drawn to a woman sitting by the window. She was focused on a book, her light brown hair tucked behind her ears, with a slight frown on her face, as if she was deeply immersed in whatever she was reading. There was something about her presence that stood out in the crowded cafe, though David couldn't quite place why. She seemed grounded, in a way that was rare in the rush of city life. David ordered his coffee and found a seat not too far from her. He told himself it was just a coincidence that he sat nearby, but there was something magnetic about her quiet demeanor. He sipped his coffee and tried not to stare. A few minutes later, a small accident broke the ice. Emily, while adjusting her seat, knocked her cup over, spilling her tea across the table. David instinctively stood up, grabbing napkins and rushing over. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, offering her a smile that he hadn't realized had come so easily. "Thank you," she responded, her voice soft yet filled with a calm confidence. As they wiped the mess together, their hands briefly touched, and for a moment, David felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of warmth, of connection. It had been so long since he had felt anything like it. "Sorry about the mess. I get too into my reading sometimes," Emily said with a laugh that was almost contagious. David found himself smiling, something that felt strange and foreign. "No problem at all. What are you reading?" he asked, surprising himself with the small talk. Usually, he avoided conversations with strangers, especially after a long shift, but something about Emily made it feel easy. "It's just an old book on philosophy," she said, showing him the cover. "I like things that make me think." David nodded, intrigued. "Philosophy, huh? Heavy reading for a coffee break." She chuckled. "Sometimes you need a challenge, right? And what about you? You look like you've had a long day." David hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest. "I'm a cop. Just got off a shift." Emily raised an eyebrow, but her expression remained soft. "Tough job. I'm sure you have your share of challenges too." David was used to people reacting differently when they found out about his profession. Some with admiration, others with discomfort, but Emily's response felt genuine, as though she wasn't seeing just the badge, but the person behind it. As their conversation flowed, David found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Emily asked questions, not out of politeness, but out of real interest. She didn't shy away from difficult topics, and when she laughed, it felt like a breath of fresh air in his otherwise heavy world. After nearly an hour of talking, David realized with a start that he hadn't thought about work once. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was simply enjoying the moment. As he stood up to leave, he hesitated before asking, "Maybe I'll see you here again sometime?" Emily smiled, a warm, open smile. "I come here often." "I'd like that." David walked out of the cafe feeling lighter than he had in years. Something had shifted. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was more to his life than the badge he wore. Days passed, and David found himself returning to the cafe more often. Each time, he hoped to see Emily again, and soon enough, their encounters became less coincidental and more intentional. They began meeting regularly, not by arrangement, but by a mutual understanding that the cafe had become their space. What started as casual small talk quickly grew into deeper, more meaningful conversations. Emily was different from anyone David had met in a long time. She didn't see him just as a cop. Most people in his life viewed him through the lens of his job, either admiring his commitment or keeping their distance because of it. But with Emily, it was like she saw right through the uniform. She asked about his day, but more than that, she asked about him. His thoughts, his dreams, and even the things he never shared with anyone. "You don't talk much about yourself?" Emily said one evening as they sat by the window, watching the city's lights flicker against the night sky. "Why is that?" David shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "I guess I've always been more focused on the job. People don't really ask about what's underneath the badge." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "That's a shame. I think there's a lot more to you than just the badge." Her words hit him deeper than he expected. For years, David had hidden behind his work. It was easier to stay distant, to keep people at arm's length, than to let them in and risk disappointment, or worse, losing them. But with Emily, there was no sense of impending loss. She had this calm presence, a steadiness that made him feel safe in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. They began spending more time together outside of the cafe, meeting for dinner, taking walks in Central Park, and even sharing quiet moments in David's modest Brooklyn apartment. It wasn't long before Emily started asking about his life outside of work, about his family, his past, and the things he never allowed himself to dwell on. One evening, as they sat together in his apartment, Emily gently asked, "Why did things end with your ex-wife?" David, who had been avoiding the subject for weeks, finally opened up. "Karen, she was a good person, but I was married to the job, not to her. I thought if I could solve just one more case, work one more shift, it would make me feel like I was doing something that mattered. But I was never there when she needed me. She deserved better than that." Emily didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she simply listened, which was exactly what David needed. "It sounds like you're carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders," she said softly. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know." Her words lingered in the air. For so long, David had convinced himself that he was supposed to carry the burden of his work by himself. The idea that someone could share it with him, or even just be there for him, was something he hadn't considered in years. But with Emily, it felt possible. As their relationship grew, David began to notice changes in himself. He started making time for things outside of work, things that brought him a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. Whether it was walking through the park with Emily, sharing quiet dinners, or simply talking about life, he found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since he was a young man. At the precinct, his colleagues began noticing the shift in him too. "You seem different lately," his partner, Mike, commented one day. "What's going on? You meet someone or something?" David smirked but didn't give much away. "Maybe," he replied, leaving Mike to wonder. The truth was, David wasn't sure what was happening himself. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just existing. He was living. Emily had become a light in his life, and while it scared him to admit how much he was beginning to care for her, the fear was overshadowed by the hope she brought with her. As David's relationship with Emily deepened, he found himself reflecting on his life in ways he hadn't before. He began questioning the choices he had made, the sacrifices he thought were necessary for the job he loved. In quiet moments, especially when he was with Emily, he would replay conversations from his past, memories that had been long buried under years of relentless work. One evening, after a particularly long day at the precinct, David sat in his living room, the city's distant hum filtering through the window. Emily was sitting across from him, reading a book, her presence comforting in its simplicity. But David's mind was elsewhere, drifting back to conversations he'd had with his ex-wife, Karen, about his work-life balance, or lack thereof. "You're never here, David," Karen had said during one of their many arguments. "Your mind is always on the job. I don't even know who you are anymore." At the time, David had dismissed her words, thinking that Karen didn't understand the importance of his work. He'd always believed that if he didn't give his all, if he didn't commit every ounce of himself to being a cop, then he wasn't doing enough. But now, years later, with Emily beside him, those words echoed in his head with a clarity he hadn't been ready to face before. "What are you thinking about?" Emily asked, breaking the silence, her eyes meeting his. David hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm just thinking about all the years I spent focused on the job. It's like I blinked, and now I'm in my 40s, and I've missed so much. So many birthdays, family gatherings, relationships. I always thought it was worth it, but now, I'm not so sure." Emily closed her book, giving him her full attention. "It's never too late to make changes, David. Just because you've sacrificed things in the past doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. You have a choice. Her words struck a chord in him. For years, he had believed that he didn't have a choice, that his commitment to the NYPD had to come first, no matter the personal cost. But now, for the first time, he was starting to realize that he could choose differently. He could still be a good cop without losing himself in the process. You ever think about what you really want? Emily asked softly. Outside of work, I mean. What would make you happy? David had asked himself that question 1,000 times, but he'd never been able to answer it. His identity was so wrapped up in being a cop that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what life could look like outside of the job. But now, with Emily in his life, the question didn't feel as daunting. Maybe there was more for him than just the badge. I don't know, David admitted, his voice quiet. I guess I've never really thought about it. For so long, it's been all about solving cases, helping people. But I've never stopped to think about what I need. Emily reached out and took his hand, her touch grounding him. You deserve to figure that out. And you don't have to do it alone. Her words stayed with him. That night, as David lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about the years he had given to the NYPD, the lives he had helped, the criminals he had put away. But he also thought about the years he had given up, time he couldn't get back. Could he really find a balance between the two? Could he be both the dedicated cop and the man who allowed himself to be happy, who nurtured a relationship, who wasn't afraid to live his life outside of work? For the first time in a long time, David didn't have the answer. But what he did have was the realization that he wanted more. More than just the precinct, more than just the job. He wanted a life that was full, not just of duties and responsibilities, but of moments, relationships, and happiness. And with Emily by his side, maybe, just maybe, that was possible. It was a cold, rainy night in late November when David's routine patrol took a sudden, unexpected turn. The streets of Brooklyn were quieter than usual, the cold wind driving most people indoors. David sat in his patrol car, listening to the low hum of the police radio, his mind wandering to Emily and their last conversation about the future. He had been more distracted than usual lately, his thoughts often drifting away from work and toward what his life might look like outside the badge. As he drove through the dimly lit streets, something faint caught his attention. It was a sound, barely audible over the rain, an eerie, weak cry that seemed out of place in the night. He slowed his car, listening more intently. The cry came again, unmistakable this time. It was the sound of a baby, but faint and fragile, as if it was coming from somewhere hidden. David stopped the car and got out, pulling his flashlight from his belt. He moved cautiously, the rain soaking through his jacket as he followed the sound. It led him to a dark alley, littered with trash bins and discarded cardboard boxes. The cry grew louder, more desperate. His heart pounded as he scanned the area, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then he saw it, a small, filthy blanket sticking out from behind one of the dumpsters. His stomach clenched as he hurried toward it. Pulling the blanket aside, he found a newborn baby, shivering and barely moving. The infant was wrapped in thin, dirty rags, its face pale and cold to the touch. David's breath caught in his throat. Jesus, he whispered to himself, quickly scooping the baby up in his arms. The tiny child was weak, its cries faint, barely clinging to life. David felt a surge of panic rise within him. Rare feeling for a man who had faced life-threatening situations countless times before. But this was different. This was an innocent life, helpless and abandoned, left to die in the cold. David moved swiftly, his instincts taking over. He rushed back to his patrol car, cradling the baby against his chest to keep it warm. His heart raced as he called for an ambulance, but the urgency of the situation pushed him to take action on his own. He couldn't wait for backup. Hang on, little one. Stay with me, David muttered, as he carefully placed the baby in the back seat, turning on the heat full blast. He drove faster than he should have, racing through the rain-slicked streets toward the nearest hospital. The baby's faint cries echoed in the car, each one a reminder of how fragile this life was. As he sped through the night, flashes of his own life, his choices, and his regrets surfaced in his mind. How many times had he chosen duty over people? How many lives had he touched through his work, only to neglect the people who cared for him outside of it? But this was different. This was life and death, pure and simple. And in this moment, nothing mattered more than saving this child. David arrived at the emergency room entrance, not waiting for help to come. He carried the baby inside, shouting for a nurse. "I found this baby. He's barely alive." His voice, usually so steady, trembled with urgency. The medical team rushed to take the baby from his arms, and David watched, helpless and soaked, as they disappeared into the hospital's neon-lit corridors. His chest tightened with anxiety, a rare and unsettling feeling for someone so used to handling crisis situations. He had no control now, no way to know if the child would survive. Standing alone in the hospital's waiting area, David realized how profoundly this moment had affected him. The image of the helpless baby lying in that dirty alley would be burned into his mind forever. He had seen many tragic things in his career, but nothing had hit him quite like this. This child had no one. No family, no protection, no one to care for it. In that moment, David felt the weight of all the decisions he'd made in his life. The sacrifices, the missed connections, the loneliness. But in saving this baby, he realized something about himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly making a difference, not just as a cop, but as a human being. It was a strange, powerful feeling, and he couldn't shake it. David stood in the hospital's waiting room, the weight of the night pressing down on him. His soaked uniform clung to his skin, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His mind was on the baby, so small, so fragile, and the haunting image of its tiny, shivering body wrapped in filthy rags. He had been in plenty of dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. This was a life that had almost slipped away, left in a dark alley, utterly abandoned. A nurse approached him after what felt like hours. "The baby's stable," she said with a gentle smile. "We've got him warmed up, and he's responding well. You got him here just in time." Relief flooded David's chest, and for a moment, he felt like he could breathe again. "Thank God," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "Will he be okay?" The nurse nodded. "He's still weak, but we're monitoring him closely. It'll take some time, but it looks like he's going to make it." "It's a miracle, really." David exhaled, the tension that had been gripping his body slowly easing. A part of him wanted to collapse from the exhaustion of the night, but the other part couldn't shake the emotional weight of what had happened. The reality of it was almost too much to bear. A helpless baby left to die. He couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing that fragile life. "Any idea who the parents are?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. The nurse shook her head. "No, we've alerted the authorities, but there's no information so far. It's going to be a long process to figure out where he came from and why he was abandoned." David nodded, though his stomach twisted at the thought. He had seen so many tragic situations over the years, but this one hit him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just about the baby. It was something deeper. He felt like he had been jolted awake, forced to confront something inside himself that he had been avoiding for too long. As he left the hospital, the rain had stopped, but the night air was still cold and heavy. The streets were quiet, just the occasional car passing by, and David found himself walking slowly back to his car, his thoughts spinning. He couldn't stop thinking about the baby. So innocent, yet almost lost forever. In saving that child, David felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose beyond the routine of the job. Later that night, as he sat in his apartment, the events of the evening played over and over in his mind. The image of the baby in that dark alley wouldn't leave him. David knew that in his line of work, he couldn't save everyone. But this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was life in its most vulnerable form, and it had shaken something loose in him. He picked up his phone and, almost without thinking, dialed Emily's number. The phone rang only twice before she answered, her voice soft but alert. "David? Everything okay?" For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The events of the night had left him emotionally raw in a way he hadn't expected. I found a baby tonight. In an alley. He was barely alive." Emily was silent for a beat, processing his words. "Oh my God, David. Are they okay?" "They're stable now, but I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. It made me realize how fragile everything is. How quickly life can slip away." Emily's voice was calm, understanding. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been. But you saved that baby's life, David. That's something. That's everything." David stared at the ceiling, her words sinking in. "Yeah, I guess I did. But as much as the rescue had been a success, it had also unearthed something deeper inside him. It was as if the baby's vulnerability mirrored something in his own life, something he had been ignoring for years. The detachment, the loneliness, the way he had always pushed aside his personal needs in favor of the job. It all came crashing down on him in that moment. The baby was safe now, but David couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who had been saved that night. "Emily," he said softly, "I think I need to start looking at things differently. I've spent so many years focused on the job, and I'm starting to realize I've missed a lot of life because of it." Emily's voice was warm, steady. "You can still change things, David. It's never too late to start living the life you want." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Her words were simple, but they carried a truth he hadn't allowed himself to embrace. It wasn't too late. Saving that baby had shown him that there was more to life than just doing his duty. He could still make a difference, both in his job and in his own life. The days following the rescue of the abandoned baby were a blur of paperwork, meetings with Child Protective Services, and the ongoing investigation to locate the child's parents. Yet for David, the real impact of that night wasn't in the official reports or the procedural follow-ups. It was something deeper, more personal, an emotional shift he couldn't quite articulate, but one he felt with every breath. He found himself replaying the night over and over in his mind. The cold, the rain, the baby's weak cries. It gnawed at him in a way no case ever had before. For years, David had grown used to the emotional armor he wore as a cop. He had to. There was no room for vulnerability when your job was to face the worst of humanity on a daily basis. But this was different. This baby was different. One afternoon, during a rare day off, David sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the city. Normally, he would have taken the opportunity to catch up on sleep or work out, but instead, his mind was consumed with thoughts of the baby. He couldn't shake the image of that tiny, helpless life left in the trash, forgotten by the world. It felt like more than just another case. Something about it had pierced through the walls he built around himself. The precinct hadn't stopped buzzing about the rescue. Colleagues offered their congratulations, calling him a hero, but their praise only deepened the discomfort he felt inside. David didn't feel like a hero. He had done what any cop should have done, yet it left him unsettled in ways he couldn't fully explain. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was Emily. He hesitated for a moment, not because he didn't want to talk to her, but because he wasn't sure how to express the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But he answered, grateful for the sound of her voice on the other end of the line. "Hey," Emily said softly. "How are you holding up?" David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, Emily. I thought I'd be fine, but this whole thing with the baby, it's really messed with my head. I've seen horrible things before, but this, it feels different." Emily was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice calm but empathetic. "It's okay to feel that way, David. What happened wasn't just another case. You were faced with something incredibly raw. You saved a life, but I imagine it brought up a lot of other things too." David rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of her words sinking in. "I guess it did. I can't stop thinking about how easily that baby could have died if I hadn't been there. And then I start thinking about all the things I've missed in my own life. How I've always put the job first, even when it cost me everything else." Emily's voice softened. "It's understandable, David. Your work is important, but you're allowed to feel conflicted. You've spent so many years focusing on everyone else. Maybe it's time to start focusing on yourself." Her words echoed what she had said before, but now they carried a deeper meaning. David realized that the baby wasn't just a victim he had saved. It was a symbol of all the things he had ignored in his own life. His own vulnerability, his own needs, his own desire for a meaningful connection. For so long, he had buried those feelings under the guise of duty, but now they were rising to the surface. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been living this way for so long, I'm not even sure how to change." Emily's response was quiet but reassuring. "You don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take it one step at a time. You're allowed to make mistakes, to feel lost. What matters is that you're willing to try." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He appreciated how Emily never tried to fix him or offer simple solutions. She just listened, giving him the space to work through his own thoughts. It was a gift he didn't take for granted. As they talked, David realized something important. Saving that baby had forced him to confront his own emotional detachment. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about the life he wanted to live moving forward. For so long, he had been running on autopilot, letting his career dictate every decision. But now, in the wake of this event, he understood that he didn't have to keep living this way. The rescue had been a wake-up call, a reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. The baby had survived, but what about David? He wasn't just a cop. He was a man who had desires, fears, and a need for connection that he had neglected for far too long. And for the first time in years, he was ready to start changing that. After the incident with the abandoned baby, something had irrevocably shifted inside David. For the first time in years, he found himself reevaluating his priorities, not just in his career, but in his personal life as well. The rescue had triggered something in him, a desire for balance, for connection, for something more than the long hours and the weight of the badge. He realized he couldn't continue on the path he'd been on for so long, not if he wanted to live a life that felt meaningful in more ways than just his work. It wasn't an easy transition. The NYPD had been David's entire life for nearly 2 decades. The thought of pulling back, of taking more time for himself, felt almost like betrayal. But the more he reflected, the more he understood that being a good cop didn't mean sacrificing everything else in his life. It was a conversation with his partner, Mike, that brought it into focus one morning during a quiet patrol. "You've been different lately," Mike said as they cruised through Brooklyn's familiar streets. "Not in a bad way, just different. What's going on?" David hesitated, but then realized that if he couldn't open up to his closest colleague, the one who had been by his side through countless shifts, then who could he talk to? "That baby I found a few weeks back. It did something to me, Mike. Made me realize how much I've been missing. How much of myself I've given to this job." Mike, usually the jokester, was serious for once. He glanced over at David, understanding in his eyes. "Yeah, man, I get it. This job, it takes everything if you let it. But you've got to remember, you're more than just a cop. You've got a life outside this. Or at least you should." David nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I think that's what I'm realizing. I've spent years putting everything into this job. I thought it was enough, but I don't think it is anymore. I want more than just the job." "You're not talking about quitting, are you?" Mike asked, half joking but with a touch of concern. David shook his head. "No, not quitting. Just, I don't want to lose myself in it anymore. I've got this chance to have something real, something meaningful outside of work. I think I've been scared to admit that I need it." Mike chuckled, but his tone was kind. "About time, man. You deserve to be happy. Job's always going to be here, but the other stuff? You've got to fight for that." That conversation lingered in David's mind as he began to make small but significant changes in his life. He started by setting boundaries, something he had never done before. He stopped volunteering for extra shifts and began taking time off, something his superiors had long urged him to do. At first, it felt unnatural, almost wrong, to not be at the precinct every waking hour. But gradually, he realized how much better he felt, how much more present he could be when he was at work because he wasn't burning himself out. In his personal life, he began investing more in his relationship with Emily. They had grown close over the past few months, but now, David was ready to take the next step. He stopped seeing their time together as a distraction from work and started seeing it as a vital part of his life, something that brought him joy, comfort, and meaning. One evening, after a quiet dinner at Emily's apartment, they sat together on her couch, the city's skyline visible through her living room window. David hadn't felt this relaxed in years. Emily was curled up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder, the soft hum of traffic outside creating a kind of peaceful rhythm. "I've been thinking a lot lately," David said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About the future. About what I want." Emily looked up at him, her eyes soft but searching. "And what do you want?" David paused, letting the words settle in his mind before he spoke them. "I want to find balance. I've been a cop for so long. I forgot what it was like to just live, to be happy. I don't want to lose myself in the job anymore. I want more." Emily smiled, her hand gently squeezing his. "I'm glad you're starting to see that. You deserve to be happy, David. You've given so much of yourself to other people. It's time you gave something to yourself." It was a simple moment, but one that felt monumental to David. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly moving forward, toward a life that wasn't just defined by his job or his responsibilities, but by the things that brought him happiness and fulfillment. He knew the job would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to be everything. In the weeks that followed, David found a new rhythm in his life. He was still dedicated to his work, still proud of the badge he wore, but he no longer felt consumed by it. He made time for Emily, for himself, for the things he had once neglected. He even reconnected with his family, calling his sister more often and making plans to visit his aging parents, something he hadn't done in years. The changes weren't drastic or dramatic, but they were enough to make him feel alive again. The baby he had saved had, in many ways, saved him as well. It had reminded him of the fragility of life and the importance of living fully, both on and off the job. As the winter months rolled in, David Thompson found himself reflecting on how much had changed since the night he rescued the abandoned baby. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but with each passing day, David felt like he was finding himself again. Beyond the uniform, beyond the cases, beyond the constant grind of being a cop. He was still the dedicated officer his colleagues respected, but now he was also something more. A man learning to balance his professional commitment with the richness of personal life. One Saturday morning, David woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his Brooklyn apartment. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. Emily lay beside him, still asleep, her face peaceful in the early morning light. For a moment, David just watched her, realizing how lucky he was to have found someone who saw him not just as a cop, but as the person behind the badge. A man with flaws, hopes, and now, a sense of direction. The baby, now safe and healthy in the custody of Child Protective Services, remained on David's mind. He visited the hospital a few times during the initial days after the rescue, wanting to ensure that the child was getting the care it needed. It had become a symbol of something bigger for him, of second chances, not just for the baby, but for himself as well. The baby had survived, and in doing so, it had reminded David of what truly mattered: life, love, and connection. That afternoon, David met with Emily for a quiet walk through Central Park. The city's streets, always bustling, were somehow serene in this part of town, with the winter chill in the air and the holiday lights starting to twinkle in the distance. They walked hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. As they strolled past the park's iconic fountain, David slowed his pace, pulling Emily gently to a stop. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, "for a long time, I didn't think there was anything more to life than the job. I thought as long as I was helping people, that would be enough. But it wasn't." Emily turned to him, her eyes warm and understanding. "What changed?" David smiled softly. "I did. Or at least, I'm trying to. I think that night with the baby, it woke me up, made me realize that life is too short to be spent in just one part of it. I've spent so long chasing this idea of what I thought being a good cop meant, and I lost sight of what it means to just be me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You've helped me see that. Helped me realize that I don't have to choose between being a good cop and being happy. I can do both." Emily squeezed his hand, her smile gentle. "I'm glad you're seeing that, David. You deserve both." "We all do." David nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "I used to think I had to carry everything on my own, that it was my job to protect everyone else and put myself last. But I don't want to live like that anymore. I want more than just the job. I want a life." Emily smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly on the cheek. "Then let's build that life together." For David, it was a promise that meant everything. It wasn't about leaving the NYPD or abandoning the sense of duty that had shaped so much of who he was. It was about finding a way to live fully, both as a cop and as a man who deserved happiness outside of work. He had finally learned that he could be more than his badge, more than the cases he solved. He could be a partner, a friend, and someone who allowed himself to be vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, David continued his work at the precinct, but with a new sense of clarity. He no longer took on every case as if it were a matter of life and death. He learned to delegate, to trust his colleagues more, and most importantly, to trust himself to know when to step back. It wasn't easy, and some days, the old habits of overworking tried to creep back in, but with Emily by his side, he found the balance he had been missing for so long. David even began thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. He could see a life where he didn't have to be defined solely by his job, where he could still make a difference without sacrificing his personal happiness. It was a future that excited him, one filled with possibilities he had once thought were out of reach. As winter turned to spring, David found himself at peace, for the first time in a long time. The rescue of the baby had been a turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. It had reminded him that life wasn't just about the moments of crisis, but about the choices you make after them, the choices that define who you are and what kind of life you want to lead. And for David, that life was one of balance, love, and purpose. He had finally found a way to be both the cop he was proud of and the man he wanted to be. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.